We talked about value and empowerment, and ultimately as an agency, you have to provide value, and you should be looking at how you can empower so that your collective velocity is as fast as possible. AI is amazing. I mean, it's incredible. It's an amazing opportunity. It's changing weekly, and it's so exciting in terms of how we can increase the value that we deliver to customers.
You're listening to Inside Commerce, a weekly e-commerce strategy, technology and CX focused podcast hosted by experienced digital consultants and re-platform specialists James Gedd and Paul Rogers. Get insights into e-commerce strategy, leading brands, hear from industry thought leaders and leading tech vendors with practical advice to help you improve your online CX. This episode is sponsored by Shopify. We've got a really interesting debate topic rant going on today, which is about, we're looking at the impact of AI and specifically Gen AI on how e-commerce teams are going to evolve their relationship with technology agencies in the future. And the concept, I guess the key context of this is that AI in the hands of an expert versus AI in the hands of a tech novice, and how those are will drive very, very different outcomes. So before I do a little bit of a preamble about some of the discussion points, let's introduce our amazing guest today. So we have Seth who's a VP of Marketing at Commerce Layer. Hey Seth, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks.
And we have Jim, who's founder and CTO at Rotate. You've also been in the podcast for. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Good to be here, gents.
Look, gents, thanks for doing it. And Seth, I really like the fact that you reached out and suggested this, because for those of you listening, if anyone isn't on LinkedIn, which I'll be astounded by, you should get on there and just see how much noise. There is so much out there. There's a lot of constructive information, but there's also a lot of sensationalist. You must do this with AI. You must reposition your whole business model. If you don't do this, your business will fail. There's a lot of hype crap out there, which is really irritating. And what we want to do is get beyond the hype and actually talk about the reality here, looking at how AI tools are fundamentally helping e-com teams increase automation, how they're helping them do things more themselves and find efficiency gains, and wherefore what that's going to do in terms of what people can do themselves with good tech and governance versus how they can speed up processes but still need proper technical oversight and technology experts to own the delivery, the QA, all of that piece around code that will get released into a production environment. And there's so much going on. We've got leading tech vendors like Shopify just dropped additions with the AI code generator for content layouts. You've got AI specialist vendors in different areas around product discovery or chatbots continuously releasing new capabilities. You've got agencies, and Jim, you can share some of the things you're doing, who are integrating AI into not only their coding practices, but also building out tooling for customers to help them with automate. There's so much going on. So what we want to tease out is what is this? What's it going to change? And what are the gotchas that you really need to be thinking about before drinking the Kool-Aid and assuming that AI is going to solve all the problems of the world? Seth, Jim, is that a good enough setup, or is there anything you want to add in terms of what we're trying to achieve in this discussion ramble?
I think that's a great starting point. Yeah, let's get going.
Let's go.
Let's do this.
Excellent. None of us on this podcast know where this is going to end up. This is an exciting podcast for me to do, and I think this is where the industry is generally trying to work out what the direction of travel is. So we're going to start. So the context and why this discussion came about is Seth recently challenged himself to build a website without talking to a developer using Commerce Layer API and AI tools. So why don't we start there? Why did you do that, Seth? And why did you think that was an important thing to go through?
Yeah, thanks, James. The initial thought exercise was not just to build like a simple website. I wanted to build what I would consider a robust e-commerce application. And I've been leading the marketing for Commerce Layer for like 4 years now. And I talked to so many people about, use the Commerce Layer API and this idea of composable commerce. And it's easier to build and you can swap things in and out and all the talking points that surround our industry. And now I have AI coding tools. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I could build a reasonable website, a prototype of a store that would be an online e-commerce store that would use all of the components of a composable commerce setup so that I could learn very deeply how the Commerce Layer API gets integrated from the back end into a web application. And so I came up with this concept. It was, you can check it out. It's at the URL seth.house, seth.haus. And it's an e-commerce website for a triathlon store. It's called Seth's Triathlon Store. And I built it over probably about a 2-week span, from everything from using Commerce Layer's command line interface to like build out the entire e-commerce backend, and then using a series of AI coding tools to write all the front end code. And I ended up with a React application that I hosted on Netlify. And so there's a lot of things to talk about there, but I challenged myself to do it because I felt like, look, as a VP of marketing for a very technical company, and any marketer right now needs to like really use the tools that are at our fingertips, particularly in AI, to learn deeply about not only the tools that they're marketing or they're charged with marketing, like the Commerce Layer API, but also to learn like how much more a marketer can do in this day and age. And a starting point for me was to like start with the core, like get a web application built. And then I started to experiment with a bunch of other stuff there, like putting in analytics and putting in a data layer to track things and all these other things that a marketer would care about. But I needed that foundational application to start. So yeah, so I did it. And the challenge, the only requirement I put on myself is don't ever talk to a human being developer to get any help debugging it. Any other resource I can use, I can go for, but it's just I'm not allowed to ask anybody for help. And yeah, so I got there, and the website's live. I hosted the code on GitHub and put it out there. I even put it on the MIT license in case people want to like fork the code and build their own web app. I don't recommend it, but it's out there. So yeah, it was fun. It was a ton of fun. And I think I learned a lot.
Let's go. So before we come to you, Jim, on this, because this is why we got different viewpoints in this podcast, because there are, with great tools comes great responsibility. But Seth, it sounds like utopia, right? And there's enough bias out there and some of the noise about actually this, you can just do it, just create perfect production ready code. Sounds easy, sounds perfect. What's the reality? What issues did you encounter?
It is not easy. And I was trying to build a complex web application, and Jim can testify to this. When you're really trying to build a multi-market, like complex web app that can serve multiple products and with multiple currencies and build a checkout, like all the things that I did, you need to have some of that knowledge. So I would say that I don't have an expert knowledge of the Commerce Layer API because I'm not an actual developer, but I have a pretty good working knowledge of how the API works. If I didn't have that, it would have been very, very difficult for me to do what I did. So I had a good starting point on like how to at least think about how an API like Commerce Layer could deliver e-commerce data to a front end. What I had no knowledge of was how to build a React application. And that's where I got into trouble, because like I got to a point, I went through so many different coding tools. I got to a point where I had one tool, Windsurf, which many people have heard of, as my IDE, which had a coding companion built in. And I would take the recommendations that Windsurf was saying, I copy paste them into either Gemini 2.5 or Claude 4.0. I migrated to Claude 4.0 when that launched, just to gut check. And at several points, Gemini and Claude were like, yeah, that AI thing is hallucinating right now. Hit stop. Stop it from continuing to change code because it's not doing the right thing. And like, I never would have known that. And so I had to get these tools working together, because there's no way that I could have looked at what Windsurf was doing and been like, this is bad. And it was going into these loops, and it would be like, kept changing code that like, I didn't really know what it was changing. So anyway, that's the great responsibility that like comes along with these tools. Is like, Jim would look at it and go, Seth, what are you doing? Why are you even hitting go? But I was just like, yeah, go. I'm just trying to get this thing live. Bad mistake. So I learned a lot throughout that process.
What do Mattel, Victoria Beckham, Sennheiser, and Glossier all have in common? They power their businesses with Shopify. Shopify is the most innovative and scaled commerce platform on the planet. It also happens to have the best converting checkout on the planet. Shopify, powering the future of enterprise commerce. Find out more at shopify.com/enterprise.
Yeah, that's a bit like me with my WordPress site for my for digitaljuggler.com, where I go, I'll upgrade the PHP and I'll edit that. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? It's like offline. Okay, so Jim, let's come to you. You are founder and CTO. You have immense amounts of technical experience. You work across different platforms, different projects, composable, non-composable, headless, non-headless, right? So you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to just give you a one-line statement, right? Ecom teams don't need good technical leads and developers anymore. They can just code themselves. Discuss.
Yeah, I think the key thing that kind of came up was a couple of times I mentioned it was like, what are the risks? What are the risks here, right? So Seth didn't use a developer, and what are the risks involved with that? And it's like, well, the risks are exactly the same as when you use a developer, right? So you're a developer, you've got to worry about security, privacy, brand integrity, like exposure of sensitive data, all these things. Now, development isn't just like the coding. Like I love, I don't know, like Marty Kagan, author of Inspired and Silicon Valley product group, isn't it? He was like, product engineers are defined by how they code, but like the creative problems that they solve. And I think that's it, right? Actually, you're an engineer and coding is part of it. It's probably the least valuable part of it. And actually, when you're developing software from end to end, you're right? The risks are actually massive. And so you have to kind of have automated testing. Any code that we write, even if it's AI, a test is written with AI, then that's reviewed by a human, then that's reviewed by another human, and throughout those steps, you're kind of going through all this process. Now, what's the risk? It's like, well, it depends on the level of exposure, and you almost need a developer to even assess the risk, right? Because for Seth's application, the risk is actually huge. I mean, you could have card data exposure, you could have privacy exposure, you could have, there are issues in the code base. Like I did have a quick look through, but yeah, you can join the team. It's still fine, Seth. You can still join as an engineer. But I think there are so many advantages, right? And I suppose we'll get into that. But from a risk perspective, it can be pretty huge. And I think that's a concern, is that actually AI can be leveraged in a multitude of ways. And actually, when people talk about code gen, I think what we forget is actually, what's the objective? What are we trying to achieve? Seth's done this as an experiment. It's great. It's great as a learning kind of like initiative and like to understand the technologies and all this kind of stuff. But actually, if you went out and you said, I want to create a production grade website that looks great and functions well, you wouldn't approach it like this. Like, there's no way, right? You would probably just go onto Shopify, say, use, even like the Horizon theme now, right? You'd kind of go, okay, this is the style they want. It would kind of generate, the layouts and stuff. And it's like, cool. And that would be pretty safe, it would be safe. And I suppose we can kind of go into a bit more depth around very different approaches, just kind of solving the same problem, right? You kind of go, this is the end output I want, but actually there's so many different ways I can go into it. And I think in terms of code gen, there are loads of, there's so much potential. And so like for people who are non-developers, but I think, understanding the risks, understanding what you're exposing yourself to is obviously super, super critical, because it can be pretty dangerous if the guardrails aren't in.
Yeah. And there was a thought that came to me this week, because I was playing around with Shopify's new AI block generator. I was using it on my development store, and I was creating like FAQ blocks, carousels, and going through the learning process of actually what you're right, Jim, what are you trying to achieve? Because anyone can create a content layout. It's very easy. So the question is, what are you trying to achieve from a functional point of view, from a customer interaction point of view, from a design execution point of view? Then you have all of the safeguards behind it. Like, is it touching any data that has a privacy implication? Is it stuff that has to be properties? You have all those questions. And actually what it's made me realize is that potentially it's going to force people to be more rigorous in thinking about the specification behind it. Because I see too much content generator where we've got a layout, and then somebody hasn't thought about functioning exactly how it's got to work. If you go through from an engineer's mindset, you're querying, okay, not just what does it need to look like, but what are the elements? What are the interactions between the elements? Is there a hierarchy? Is there configurable elements? And what shows by default? And you have all of these sub-questions that you have to answer in order to get a detailed technical spec to create relevant code that works across devices. And I was going through thinking, actually, the intelligence in prompt design to these generators, the need for that is huge if you want to get production ready for if you're a serious brand and you're not just, you've launched your own store and it's a test and you just want to get running and selling. But if you're a proper brand where you need your brand integrity protected, you cannot just go into this without understanding the impact between the input and output.
Yeah, that's a really good point, James, because what's going part of the magic of these AI coding tools is you can just come in and get going, the vibe coding feeling, right? And it gives a lot of people this feeling of empowerment that they've never had before in their career. But it immediately short circuits the requirements that are typically brought forth in like a sprint process, or like a product manager, or in my case, like a very technical marketer sits down with like the engineering manager and says like, did you fill out the Jira story and tell us everything about it? What are your user stories? What are the requirements? And, they never say like, hey, Seth, like, what are the security requirements for this particular thing you need to do? It's never that, because like they come into it knowing, they already know fundamentally what needs to be built in to make sure that everything meets like, best in class coding practices. A lot of these tools, and I tried like 4 or 5 different ones, and you name it, like, the Lovable and Windsurf and Gemini, all of I tried so many of them. They give you this open canvas and they try to prompt you like, hey, send us a brief, just like a brief you'd send to anyone else. I want what you want to do. But yeah, you spend some time writing that brief, but like I got into so much trouble. And Jim, I'm sure you saw it in like the GitHub repo, but there at one point, and unbeknownst to me, Windsurf had exposed all of my client secret and client ID keys required for the Commerce Layer API in the public code. And then I somehow got Gemini to look at the code and they're like, dude, you have exposed all of this security stuff. And we had to refactor the whole code base to make it secure. Yeah. That never even it would never even came into my mind when I was like, started just like this wild prompting of like what I wanted to do. I was kind of the cat behind the keyboard, just like moving fast, I
mean, that's totally the example. When it's saying you expose something like that and it's like, cool, I'm potentially exposing admin API access to my entire account, right? Like how incredibly dangerous is that? And someone who's not as knowledgeable as you, Seth, as well, might kind of go, cool, I'll just change that, I'll make a new commit. And it's like, well, it's in history now. It's in the history of like a publicly available repo, right? So it doesn't matter if you change it, you actually have to completely kill it, right? You have to get rid of this because it's there, right? And then there's all other things like, was that crawled? Was that repo when it was when it was public crawled? And is that now somewhere else? There is so many considerations within that, and like you say, I suppose people just see the coding aspect and actually kind of go, well, no, this is an entire process, right? Like a product mindset where you're kind of going, actually, the first question is like, what's the objectives of the business? What are the goals we're trying to achieve? All these kind of things. Yeah, actually, code is literally just code is us kind of being the conduit, right? The translator of those ideas once we have them, and kind of interfacing with machines to kind of make those a reality. And I think the amazing thing with that AI, the most amazing thing out of all of it, is kind of moving from this interaction with computers that we've had historically, right? Punch cards and keyboards, mice, touchscreens, to something where we can express ourselves in a way more humanistic kind of like way, where the machine understands intent on a more humanistic level, right? Where we can say, actually, I want this. And the machine can just understand that. And you're interfacing in just a far more, human way, which I think is an absolute joy. And actually is one of the huge positives of AI in terms of how that's going to affect all kind of user experience, right? How we interact with machines and how we make requests and all this kind of stuff with,
Yeah, I've got, so Jim, I've got a question from the agency lens here, because one of the great challenges between clients and agency teams is on optimizing the use of the retainer to ship roadmap items, to do things proactively rather than just on maintenance. And when you're having to build code for new capabilities and features, there's the overhead of doing that, and there's the QA, then there's all of the tests, and if there's a tweak made to it because in the staging or the test team environment, it didn't quite hit the mark, then you have to go back and redo it, because obviously any change to code can impact other parts. What people from a client side want to get to is where the agency's speed of coding is faster, so that there's cost taken out of it. And that cost is either redistributed into more ideation, like you said, or into being able to ship things faster. I'd love to know how are you embracing this at the moment as an agency in terms of using AI to help you get efficiency gains? And do you see this being one of the main areas where you can bring benefits to merchants in the future? Or is it an unrealistic expectation?
No, it's not unrealistic at all. And I think the great thing about discussion is we don't know where things are going. I mean, no one knew when the smartphone came out, the impact it would have on dating, I mean, teenagers, mental health, all sorts of like massive impacts that these things kind of have. And with AI, every expert, says something different about where things are going. In terms of the near term, there are lots of things that we're doing. And yes, the sort of things you talk about in terms of high quality, lower costs are already kind of starting to come in. So in terms of things that we're doing at the moment, I mean, Seth mentioned like Windsurf, but like all of our engineers are using Cursor, which have, obviously AI agents kind of like built in. Pretty much all of our tests are all written like purely by AI. Debugging is becoming better. And rapid prototyping like becomes better. I mean, we're even like starting to experiment with things like in terms of our flow. So you have like a ticketing system where you move things along, and actually rather than assigning it to an engineer, assigning it to an AI agent, right? So you kind of go, actually, here's an idea, cool. Actually write the PRD, and you assign that to the PRD agent, right? And that writes up the spec, and it writes it up in a standardized format. And so I suppose across the agency, you kind of go, actually, it's not just about the code gen aspects of it. And actually that's the part where it's good at the moment, as in, well, it's good. It's okay at the moment if you're very narrow and you're very focused. With something like Seth, where you're talking about a massive code base, it falls down pretty quickly. But when you're kind of saying, actually, I want this function, it's doing something very specific, and you've got autocompletes and all these things, it does speed up the engineer's time. And most importantly, a cost prohibitive thing, especially with agencies where costs are like, we have to keep costs low, is you always want to pair program. You always want to work with another engineer, and you want to kind of like bounce ideas off them. Now that's quite hard because obviously you've got the extra resource of just the luxury of having two engineers working on the same problem. The idea is it does speed up velocity, but not twice as fast, in reality. The idea that the tool becomes more of a collaborator is definitely the case. Like rubber ducking is what they call it, or, pair programming. But you're doing that with the machine, and that's really great. So for all the code bases now, we're adding extra documents within the code bases. We're adding rules and stuff as well. So we're adding way more context for the AI so it can be more informed and help us move kind of quicker. We're not far off getting to a place where, to be honest, a client issues like an issue that comes in as a ticket, it's automatically assigned to a debugger. That kind of, as an agent, that reviews the code, spots issues, does a PR, and then a human comes along and kind of goes, okay, cool. And so we're already seeing like some like early days, but we're seeing like efficiency gains already. But more than that, like we've got way better code coverage, the quality of the output's better. So yeah, and I think obviously the more important thing is the AI tools that as an agency you can help brands leverage, from automatic, alt tag writing, translations, tone of voice, all these kind of things, like automatically building that into their kind of like business OS, as it were. But yeah, so we're doing a slew of things. Part of it's around engineering, part of it's like the whole life cycle as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for merchants out there, e-commerce leaders, team members, these are the conversations you should be having with your agency partner to understand how they're operating, how it's impacting, and what that could do to the way that you work in future. It's such an important conversation because we touched on this earlier. There's no right answer to this. Like, people are on different learning paths at different speeds, and it's dependent on the ecosystem you're working in, the tech tools, your platforms you're using. But this conversation is important. So you obviously work for one of the leading e-com platforms. Where do you see it evolving to at the platform side? Like, what is the role within Commerce Layer, for example, of AI? Like, how fast is that adoption? How much is being used to automate process and to get those efficiency gains?
Yeah, so internally, from like an engineering standpoint, it's like a lot of the same stuff Jim mentioned. There's going to be like efficiencies that the team can now build into how it creates code, how it reviews PRs, how it ships code. But then we're at an interesting use case, which is wholly different from agencies and SIs, which is, we're an API. And so a lot of the times to engage with our API requires the customer, the merchant, to give our API data formatted in a JSON object that's very complex to create. And like the most recent example would be like our promotion rules engine. It's an incredibly powerful promotion rules engine that can allow merchants to do really, multiple different combinations of promotions. But to get the API to to do that, you have to give it something in a very like code formatted way. And so the typical like e-commerce manager or marketer who might be trying to put together some type of like sales campaign for a suite of products is not going to be writing JSON that the commerce layer API can parse. So they need a developer to do that. Okay, not ideal. So what we're able to now do is build AI agents, typical kind of what we hear a lot of these days of just using like an MCP protocol where like end user puts in some natural language. I want to do a set of promotions with this. These are the SKUs I want to do the promotions around, and give me the JSON that I need for commerce layer. And then we can build out an actual interface that communicates with our API, returns the JSON, has that JSON validated and tested before the end user even gets it, and gives the end user something and as a response that they can just immediately go and create a promotion for. They can then copy paste that into the commerce layer UI. To have built like an actual user experience and user interface around the promotions engine would have been incredibly difficult because of like, I won't say infinite number of combinations, but you understand what I'm saying, like just the limitless number of combinations that any merchant could put together that utilizes the power of our rules engine. But with AI, with like an agent, we can expose a user experience that someone just types in like, hey, I want to do a promotion. This is what I want to do. And they get the JSON back, already tested, already validated, and then they can move forward. So we have the development stuff Jim talked about, but then there's like a product layer that we can now build into our API that gets people using the API much quicker.
Yeah, I really like this. I was having a conversation I was at a Centre event last night, and I was chatting with Martin, the CEO, who's now going to be the chief product officer, about where platforms sit in. And this is a bit where I was saying is I think the agent part of helping people to solve like day in, day out common tasks where you don't want to take up your engineering resource, which should be focused on like fixing major problems and real value add thinking, like you were saying earlier, Jim. But you're seeing it now in things like Sidekick and Shopify, and every platform has its own way of giving people that interface. But ability to create discounts is a great one. I was doing it at Shopify is like, create me a free shipping discount that's only eligible on orders over X and is one use. And as long as you know the functional limitations of the tool, what you can and cannot do from an eligibility exclusion criteria thing, and you're very precise in it, it's bam, it's done, it's set up. And for me, it's this part where platforms can add so much value to e-com teams by speeding up decision making and tasks for like low complexity stuff. But then it's also the predictive bit of the chat interface that you can bring in. So you see that there are some predictive analytics tools out there where they will do analysis of the data and automatically give you like tasks of you could improve margin by doing X, or this product is not selling well. But the ability for somebody within a e-com platforms to be like, tell me which products are best selling at Easter in France and have margin of over 25%. Yeah, things where trading teams just want answers and they can just get quick.
Totally. Yeah, like we have a metrics API, but to have made that query in the past was difficult. Now we can build interfaces with agents that make those queries very simple. Another thing that I think is interesting about like commerce in general is that there is a physical product sitting in a warehouse somewhere that is an actual thing. It's not artificial. And so like the commerce layer API still serves a tremendous function of being able to like validate that thing exists. It has a price. It has a certain currency that it can be purchased in. It has a certain market. There's all these business rules that need to be defined by the API, and the API can be accessed by anything. So like what I think we're excited about is that future of like where agents just interact directly with our API, because we're very defensible in that regard, because like we know how much stock there is in a stock location. It's real. This isn't artificial stock, and we will only make a transaction happen if that stock is there. And so I think like that's like a really interesting place to be as well as an API. There's a very huge promise there for like what this new agentic experience can bring to us. Like we're like, hey, ChatGPT wants to own checkout. Cool. You still need to know if there's actually a product there to be sold,
I think swarms of agents, right? Where you are in this, exactly as you say, Seth, right? You kind of go, we've got an MCP server, right? And Shopify have theirs, you've got yours, and the great thing is it decouples it from the actual agent. So you have a custom agent, and you as an e-commerce like merchant, you're there and you can say, okay, I've got a new promotion, and your agents kind of swarm off, right? And there's these MCP connections with each with very defined prompts, and also they've got build up context specific around your business. The analytics agent is feeding back other like previous experiments. It knows what works. It sets up that, they're all kind of spawning off and doing these different things. You're right in terms of, and again, I suppose it comes back to that idea of you go to commerce layer or even like Shopify, the amount of configurability around some of these things, it's just a level of like the abstraction where you can express your intent. And that could be, and at the moment that's tends to be quite platform specific because the MCP stuff is pretty new still, right? In terms of it's not ubiquitous. So the idea that we'll get to a place though where it's like, actually, I can build an MCP server on top of the Shopify MCP server, or a custom one, which shuts down the amount of functionality that Shopify is offering or augments it and adds more. And as long as programmatically, as like Seth was saying, as long as programmatically it's exposed, right? As long as you have APIs and stuff, you can kind of build out those servers for custom kind of like rules. And I think you said right at the beginning, James, right? Actually, different businesses are going to have different requirements, right? The depth that they want, the level of configurability like they want is going to be completely different. If you think of CMS at the moment, some clients we give vast creative control to because they have teams that have got creative expertise, really amazing art direction and everything. And for others, we don't give them that exposure because, more choice isn't always more freedom and more empowerment, right? Actually, often it's quite the opposite. You're kind of a choice paralysis, and actually it's not allowing us to focus on what's really important. But yes, I think the next step where, through NCP services, as kind of Seth, spoke about, where you can actually have a agent which speaks to all of your kind of core tools and can orchestrate this stuff is definitely where it's going to go, right?
Yeah, no, linked to that, let's talk about this point about business is different, because it's always saying the hype is always every business must do this or they're going to die. Whereas the reality is we know that you have a startup that just wants a basic store to sell. You have a DC brand that's in fast growth and actually they're accelerating rapidly and their team's expanding almost monthly. You have huge enterprise, and I'm talking enterprise from a systems complexity, not from a revenue point of view, where they have crazy systems architecture and they have insane compliance requirements and massive discipline around the security piece you're talking about earlier. And then I'm working with a brand that's part of the Nestle group, that every brand in that company has to adhere to the security and compliance policies of Nestle. And when you've got public listed companies, we all know the amount of scrutiny that you get under, and they need to be really spot on that. So how does this play out in terms of how do you put safeguards in to the relationship between a development partner and a strategic partner like yourself and a company that might want to do they might want to do some code generation themselves? What are the safeguards and how do you build those in so that you don't get this divergence where some in-house people have created some code that's screwed up a theme or a site or created a compliance risk?
Yeah, I suppose it's how you leverage AI now for the business. We talked about the whole life cycle of a feature, right? And we said actually a lot of it starts with your objectives and your goals and challenges and opportunities, and then coming up with like an idea. And I suppose actually when you come up with an idea, it's a risk, right? You're going to spend money on engineering to kind of build that out. And then at that point you find out if it works, if it actually has an impact to your business. So you're building up risk, and as much as it's obviously valuable to build the right, something well, it's more valuable to build the right thing, right? So in terms of how I suppose businesses now can like really leverage AI within like safe constraints, I would say like first of all POCs, like use Lovable, use like Vault to kind of actually build out your ideas, test them internally. And when I say internally, I mean maybe get small pools of customers. You only need like 5-6 customers to start actually getting a good feel for things. You don't need massive like sets of data. And what you're doing here is you're de-risking any initiative that you do. You're also like flexing your kind of product thinking kind of muscle within the business to kind of go, actually, we've got an idea of something. We're going to do quick proof of concept. We're going to understand, the kind of edges of this. At the end of that, you're in a position where you can actually get AI to look at your proof of concept and actually create a spec and then you can hand that over to an engineering team to kind of produce production kind of quality code. If you're not doing that and you actually want to take it a step further and get things into production, you have to do it within really safe parameters, right? I mean, Shopify is probably one of the few exceptions where you're like, actually, this is kind of safeguarded. Within Shopify, you're not really getting, even if you're an engineer in there, there's like quite good safety kind of like restrictions. The checkout, changes to account area. These are all about compliance, privacy, and safety around kind of like commerce. So if you're going to go to that step and you're going to do things like the code generation, block generation that you mentioned earlier, James, you'd kind of, fine. If you want to take it that step further, you do that. You speak to your technical team first, understand that you're not going to create any risk around this stuff. And then when you've got something that you're happy with, then use, testing in Shopify is not great, but use something like Intelligence. Use 5%. Make sure you've got testing for like automated testing for end to end. Make sure you've got alerts through, for tracking when things kind of drop. And then just monitor it. Keep an eye on things. Make sure that you are seeing statistical significance, that this is an improvement. And at that point, again, you can either get it built for like production quality. You can have an engineer just review to make sure you're not introducing technical debt. So in terms of, and again, this comes down to where you are as a business, right? As you said earlier, James, as well. So what's your appetite for risk? What is the true risk here? How much revenue is going through this store? All these kind of questions. But as a very minimum, you can start as a merchant, as a team, to kind of experiment with POCs, push that through internally as much as, we try and understand as much as we can about the merchants, but they ultimately are the product experts and they understand their customers and understand their products better than we do. And for them to experiment with some of these things to kind of validate ideas to a certain level is definitely going to save costs and also help, as I said, like build in that kind of product model muscle within the internal teams.
I think that's like where I started. I never wanted this to be anything but a prototype. So if you were to imagine myself being like a mid-size or a large-size enterprise merchant who's considering shifting to something like Commerce Layer or any of the other composable approaches, and the internal pushback from like the CTO or the VP of engineering is like, well, I don't know, like this works. If it's like not broken, what are we trying to fix? I could prototype, a non-engineer like myself, I could get a working prototype using Commerce Layer up in like under a week. It allows me to then make my case internally where it's like, look, I have multi-market support with like SKU lists across all the markets with different currencies. And these are things that we're limited by with our current platform. And I did it in a week using this thing. That internal prototype can really drive change internally. So like, that's like a great use case of these coding tools for sure. It's like internal prototyping to prove more than just like a concept, like show a thing that actually works.
Massively de-risking it, right? Hugely. When you do something like that.
But this is where, that's at a more advanced level. When I'm thinking about most teams I work with, it's this trading of the site that is their priority, right? They are day in, day out, updating content, managing products, doing promotions, campaigns, landing pages, you name it. And they want quick turnaround. They want to see stuff. And we've moved, a lot of businesses have moved from the old legacy staging, production, replication thing, and are doing a lot through like themes and visual previews, and the ability to have a test theme that is not impacting your production one, and just to be able to mess around with code generation on. For me, it's ideation. It's not production ready code, but it's okay. I want a landing page that's got this kind of structure and these types of layouts and functions, right? Hey, AI, build me a layout that does da-da-da-da-da-da. Now let me have a look at the shell. Actually, that looks all right. Now I kind of want it to do this though. Great. Now I've gone through the ideation. I've refined my viewpoint of what that page should be. Now I've got a tight design spec to give to my expert development partner to turn the raw code into production ready code and think about those other things. So I can see those AI generators not being the final end product, but being brilliant at speeding up that design thinking within client side teams.
Yeah, for sure. I can go really quickly on this, and then Jim, I know you can take more of it. But like, what I did for mine, James, is I did as part of my initial prompt, I submitted screenshots of like websites that I liked that I know are Commerce Layer customers. And so like Solomon, for example, is an outdoor gear store. And so I was quickly could do some screenshots of like the flow from their main landing page to like a product listing page to a product details page. I submitted all of those as part of it. I said, and by the way, make the design kind of look like this. And the initial design sort of looked like that, which is really cool. So you could imagine like if internally I had a pre-existing design and I thought there was a competitor website that I really liked, or maybe not even a competitor, just another website that I really admired. When I submitted those design requests to the prompt, it gave me something that sort of looked like that rather than just like coming up with something out of the blue. And the nice thing about that is if you're getting these like contrived like themes and you're continually told by your engineering team, like, that's not going to work with the theme builder we have. Now you can actually maybe push the envelope there. But anyway, Jim, I'm sure you have a lot more to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose again, it comes down to what you're trying to achieve. I think if you look at Shopify, Horizon, right, and you kind of go, actually, this is one theme. There's loads of different iterations of it because it's got so many variables under the hood. And I think that's really interesting because actually, you get to a point where you're not actually doing code generation. You're kind of taking intent and you're making loads of settings, entering kind of copy, images, and all this kind of stuff to actually realize that. And I think that's where I think that's the side where I think is near term really, really powerful. So if you kind of went, okay, and there's no risk there as well, not in the same way because it's kind of, it's kind of protected. You're not doing original kind of code generation. So if you're kind of going, actually, and Shopify will move forward with this way more aggressively than they are at the moment. But if you kind of said, actually, I want a new landing page, and then this is what I'm trying to communicate, and this is the sort of audience, and they're like, okay, here are your blocks, here's how it's laid out, here's how we're communicating this. And you're like, cool. And that is production ready, right? And that's kind of ready to go. And I suppose, I said, in terms of, I suppose there's a few different things we're talking about. There's prototyping and validating ideas early on, so you're de-risking things. Then there's actually code gen within quite a walled garden, quite a guarded and safe space where you can do experimentation. But that experimentation isn't code generation. It's settings and underlying technology changes, which is, again, really, really safe. And then you've got actual, unique code, which if you're doing that, then there's obviously a slew of safety precautions that you have to make, and definitely split testing and making sure you've got these kind of guardrails in place.
Yeah, and I've got, I say one final question. Christ, I could talk about this with you guys for hours because I think it's really, really interesting. And it's so valuable for all of us working in the ecosystem to have these conversations because this is evolving and it's evolving fast, as you both said at the start. And having a short-term and then a mid to long-term view on this is really important. And the mid to long-term will evolve, we know it. But I think having a short-term view of how you will use and explore and change is important. But my question, I'll come to you first, Seth, because you raised this to me when we first discussed this episode, which is e-commerce teams are going to need to understand prompt engineering and writing accurate prompts because whichever tools they end up using, whether it's within a platform like a Shopify or Commerce Layer, or it's a specialist AI tool that they've got, or they're using interfaces like the Chat GPTs, understanding the structure of the data that you put in and the impact it has on the quality that comes out. So do you think all e-commerce teams need prompt engineering strategy, or is this on a case-by-case basis?
I think every e-commerce team will need a prompt engineering strategy to some extent. I think every marketing team is going to need a prompt marketing strategy. And I think agencies and GSIs will need to build in hire engineers who have a vast knowledge of how to write code and then prompting in the most efficient way. Because if done properly by an expert, the velocity by which you can do something is tremendous. And I know this is sort of it's sort of like pop psychology, but there's that famous book by Malcolm Gladwell that talks about 10,000 hours to master something. And so, Jim, you've been a developer your whole life. It's certainly well over 10,000 hours of writing code. And I'm not saying that I produced anything that was expert, but in a matter of several hours over the course of a week or two, I was able to create something I never would have been able to create before. But I took the amount of time and I divided it by 10. I divided it into 10,000, and I saw that I had a 500x increase in my own productivity based on how many hours it took me to build this thing. I think it was 20 hours total. And the point being that I think prompt engineering would have an even higher factor of like productivity gains. So everybody, in my opinion, needs to be thinking about that. If you're hiring an agency or a GSI, I would ask about what your prompt engineering strategy is. If you're interviewing as an engineer or interviewing at an agency, I would ask them what their prompt engineering strategy is, because yeah, I think it's critical.
Jim, what's your take? Is this something that's already coming up with clients you're working with? Is this something you're advising them on?
Just going over Seth's comments. Yeah, no, I think it comes down to a few things. I mean, I think agencies, their roles going to change a bit, right? As in terms of, rather than just being creators, there needs to be educators and curators, right? And a part of that kind of prompt strategy, I suppose, is actually being, we want to empower and accelerate and, the people we work with. And part of that means actually making sure that rather than having another kind of conduit, to kind of like to these things, actually, we want to kind of make sure that the tool is curated around them. At the moment, you're going into fairly generic agents like Seth is, right? And he's kind of going in, he's saying, here you go. Now, if we, as an agency, said, actually, here's all the context that you need to kind of know AI, and here's like a bit about the brand and all these kind of things. And like you're saying, for marketing, for like all the different kind of verticals within the business, and actually having quite a distinct identity, right? And so you're kind of going, okay, I want to engineer something, And it's like, okay, as a business, this is what you use. Here are the systems that you use. Here are the considerations that I need to be aware of, And I suppose part of the agency role, I suppose, evolving as part of this is actually kind of going, how do we make sure that you are getting the most out of AI, right? How rather than just like the agency kind of having a strategy around this, how does the agency make sure that the client has a strategy and that we empower that and we make sure the efficacy is as great as it possibly can kind of be? And I suppose that's where I see, at least like for business like Rotate, where that kind of moves to, right? Like we are composable in our DNA as an agency. And if we talked about MCP servers and all this kind of stuff, how do we make sure that we are empowering the merchant as much as possible, across this kind of like tool? So yes, in terms of Seth's comment about like I've done my 10,000 hours in 5 hours or whatever, like I suppose it's it's not as simple as that, I suppose. And also, and I know that probably to be controversial, but I suppose it's a bit like you can recreate Picasso, but I suppose the kind of the journey you've gone on to kind of get to that is obviously quite good. It's quite different, and the understanding and the expertise you can kind of bring around that is obviously
I think
very different.
like the point I'm trying to make is not that I'm an expert. The point I'm trying to make is like I had no capability to build what I built. And I did something that I would consider an expert like you, if it were actually production level code, would need to have spent their lives becoming an expert. And I'm not saying what I did was expertise. I'm just saying I spent about 20 hours and built this like fairly complex web application, which was an impossibility 6 months ago. And it led me to this belief that like, if I were an e-commerce merchant hiring an agency, I would really want to know their fundamental understanding of all the security and guardrails they're putting in place for their prompt strategy, rather than just handing over the keys to the kingdom to someone like a Seth who goes off and is like, I built you this thing in 20 hours, ship it. Like, I would want to hear from you, Jim, like, no, guys, like, let's step everything you've just been saying. What do you want to do? Like, what are we building? Let's talk about the process. And yes, we use this stuff to make our code even better, but like, it still doesn't tick all the boxes. And like, I think that's the thing that I would be prying into, is like, someone needs to have a very solid answer to their internal prompt engineering strategy to give me the confidence that they know how to use these tools properly, rather than just like, oh yeah, we use Cursor and all of our developers have a seat and we just all crank out code. That's a bad answer for me. Like, I want to know how you're like making good code. Nothing go live.
I think this is a really good way to summarize this. That every e-commerce team should be thinking about what the role of AI tools is in their business to give them faster speed to market, great efficiency, reducing costs. But they should understand that using AI to generate code introduces risk to the business if you do not have the technical expertise to QA it and ensure that it is compliant. And that's why proper technical leads, whether you have internal engineering or you're working with a third party like a Rotate, that is critical. But yes, in the relationship with your agency, you need to explore and understand what the decisions they're making and how they are changing, how that impacts you, and is there anything, there's a red flag that it raises a risk to your business, or actually is it creating an opportunity where you can work smarter with them to do things faster or get more through because of the way that they're building efficiency. So I think this is a really exciting time, but I think the word for me is caution. Is with all good new shiny stuff, is don't think it's the magic pill that cures everything. You still need good governance.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point I think, Jim, you've been making. I'll give you the last word, but I think my final word is something I heard just yesterday in like a lecture, and it was this person was talking about like AI will never tell you what it doesn't know, because it doesn't know what it doesn't know. It's trained to give you an answer. And so like for like a less structured like team that uses AI for everything, you'll step into some hallucination and you'll be getting things. And if you're not an expert yourself, you won't know how to debug what you're getting back. And the same goes for marketers who are trying to use AI to do everything. AI to write copy. Like you're going to get generic copy that isn't going to do anything, whatever the case may be for marketers themselves. But I think like that's a really fascinating concept, is that stepping into it with caution and understanding that like some of the best doctors that are out there are the ones who actually say, I don't know. I don't know what to do next. But we're going to have to experiment our way into like solving this like illness that might be hitting you. But doctors are always like, oh, this is what's happening for sure. And then like you go through this thing and it never gets healed, right? Then that's a problem. So I think like that's like the wisest people are going to be the ones that are like ready to say, we don't know. Sure, we use AI to help us. We don't know how to solve that. Let's work on it together.
And I suppose, thematically, right, in terms of AI is an opportunity, right? And we talked about value and empowerment. And ultimately, as an agency, you have to provide value, and you should be looking at how you can empower them so that your collective velocity is as fast as possible. I think James just said, we want to be working on the problems that only we, that we have to, because there's no one else who can kind of work on those. And we want to empower the client as much as possible to work on, elsewhere. So AI is it's incredible. It's an amazing opportunity. It's changing weekly, and it's so exciting in terms of how we can increase the value that we kind of deliver to kind of customers. But I suppose on both sides, if you're not moving as an agency, if you're not adopting this stuff, if you're not looking for new ways to add value, you're going to unfortunately become, you will become irrelevant. And that's unfortunately always been the case. That's never been any different. If you're not providing value, there's a problem, right? And AI will radically change what value means, because many of the actions that we take today that are deemed as valuable will become productized and diminished around that stuff.
Yeah, and just for clarity, anyone listening, what we're not saying is if you don't do these three things, your agency's dead, because we're not the hypists. But look, Jake, I could carry on chatting for hours on this. I'm not going to send everyone else listening to sleep, but thank you both. So Seth, thank you for thanks for coming back on. Jim, always enjoy chatting to you as well. I have a lot of respect for what you're both doing. And anyone wants to reach out, anyone's listening who's interested in being Pete or fundamentally disagrees and wants to rant at us, do reach out. And there's contact details on the landing page on the website, but you can find Seth and Jim on LinkedIn, and they're always happy to chat. And if you've got projects where you are looking for somebody to give advice and guidance on, well, these are the gents to speak to. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.